Hello, my name's Rich McCue, and I'm doing a screencast of a presentation that I did at the St. George Post-Mormon meeting on February 3rd, 2008. The topic of my presentation is maintaining relationships as a person becomes post-Mormon. I'll start by talking about things I went through as my older brother left the church about 4 years before I did. I can still remember not sleeping well for several weeks after first hearing that my brother Bob was leaving the church. I was shocked, disappointed, and confused. Bob had always been a strong supporter and defender of the church, and Bob always gave powerful, compelling gospel talks, and always bore testimony of its truthfulness. When I was having serious doubts about going on a mission for the church after my first year of university, it was Bob and my father who convinced me that if I persevered, that a testimony would come. I leaned on their testimonies to get me through the MTC. I didn't feel like I had any spiritual experiences strong enough that I could truthfully say that I knew that the church was true. It wasn't until about halfway through my mission that I had two experiences that I interpreted as God's confirmation to me that I was doing what He wanted me to do. I then went on cruise control until my early 30s. I can't remember exactly how I found out that Bob was leaving the church, but it was in late 2002 that I received the news. Here is my response to Bob in an email. Bob, I'm familiar with almost all the issues and arguments that are in your letter. I hope that I can briefly share with you my perspective on them. I don't know if you remember the spiritual struggle I went through before and at the beginning of my mission, but much of that struggle was due to anti-Mormon literature and some philosophical concepts that I was introduced to during my first year of university. Look up Pascal's Wager and Doxastic Surrender for some fun sometime. In any case, I really struggled for well over a year with those issues. Some of them I was able to resolve through study and logic, and others did not seem to have a reliable answer one way or the other through research. It wasn't until the beginning of my mission, when I had some powerful spiritual experiences while teaching and eventually testifying about Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, that I found peace. I still do not have answers to every one of the questions I had, but those spiritual experiences have anchored me in the midst of contradictory and sometimes changing academic thought on the scriptures and church history. I'm grateful that I continue to enjoy that peace today. Love, Rich. It's really interesting to read what I wrote back then from my current perspective outside the church. While I was aware in very general terms about polygamy, blacks in the priesthood, etc., I was not aware of the very troubling specifics about these doctrines. I would like to think that if I had taken the time to do some research, that I would have been more open-minded. The problem was, I didn't want to look any further, if at all possible. I had my spiritual experiences, and that is what I was going to hang my hat on for as long as I could. I read Bob's emails, but I either did not read them carefully or I didn't finish reading them because of their length. Here is a graphical representation of the ebb and flow of the emails on Mormonism and spirituality from Bob. Starting in late 2002, Bob wrote quite a few emails in 2003 and then slowly dropped off over the years. And as Bob pointed out, if we'd done a word count on the length of the emails and documents he sent, the graph would be spike even higher in 2003 and 2004 because he wrote so much during those first years. My transition from very active member in the church to post-Mormon happened gradually between mid-2005 and 2007. Interestingly, at roughly the same time that the flow of emails from Bob dropped off. In December 2004, I was diagnosed with hairy cell leukemia, a relatively treatable form of cancer. This was an intense experience for me and my family. In spite of this extremely stressful situation, I didn't have any great spiritual experiences, which I seemed to expect on some level. I was facing my mortality in a way that I never had before. I also noticed that I was periodically having what I interpreted as spiritual feelings in some very unspiritual settings, like action movies, soccer games, etc. Why would this happen? Why would the Holy Ghost be touching my heart during the born identity? I knew Bob was well-informed, or is well-informed and intelligent, and couldn't reconcile in my mind the fact that a smart person who knew a lot about the church would walk away from it with their wise-eyed open. Small things started to add up. One of my co-workers, a law professor, who's a former member of the church, told me that in her view the church does many good things, but that its exclusion of women from the priesthood and the treatment of gays were just wrong. Another thing was that I was listening to a few intellectual podcasts that would periodically talk about religion and spirituality. Usually not about Mormonism, just about religion in general. Their treatment of religion made me think more critically about my own faith. Another thing was that I work with some wonderful, loving people who are in committed gay relationships. This did not sync with the image of the gay lifestyle that I had heard about from my priesthood leaders when I was growing up. Finally, about 2 years ago, as I was writing my personal history, I realized that I was writing parts of it from a Mormon perspective. Eventually, I made the decision to write it from a religiously neutral perspective and leave testimony and magical references out of it altogether. Reading my own writing in places was making me feel uncomfortable. Looking back on it now, it was probably ascribing things that were happening in my life to magical influences that are the things that I was most uneasy with. My wife was in the middle of reading Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling in about June of 2007. I had read the book about a year earlier. Our discussion of that book led to the revelation that we had similar doubts about the LDS Church, and that this had been the case for some time. Heather later told me that she'd not been comfortable with a woman's role in Mormonism for years, but didn't want to rock the boat. She had learned from a relatively young age that Mormons tend to dislike strong feminists, so she shelved a lot of her concerns, thinking her issues must have stemmed from something wrong inside of her, or too much pride. During her reading of Rough Stone Rolling, and in particular during our discussions about polygamy, and in particular, it was news to Heather that Joseph had married other faithful men's wives, we discovered that we both had serious doubts about Mormonism's foundational claims. This mutual admission empowered us to talk about our doubts that we'd had but had been afraid to talk to each other about for fear of what it might do to our marriage. Over the summer we became closer than we'd been for some time as we researched, thought, and talked about many of the LDS Church's current policies and history. It was a wonderful time, but also somewhat melancholy as we realized that at some point we were going to have to let people know that our beliefs had changed. At the very least, we knew that we wouldn't be able to renew our temple recommends, and that there would be a strain in our relationships with many of our family members and friends. At the beginning of 2007, we let my parents know that we were changing our relationship with the church. 3 or 4 days later, we met with our stake president and turned in our temple recommends, and I resigned from the High Council. At this point, Heather didn't want to have anything further to do with Mormonism, but within a few weeks she started to vacillate. I was concerned that she would start drifting back towards the church, and in an attempt to help her, I started emailing her links and printing out things for her to read to try to pull her back my way. I was forcing the issue, and it wasn't helping her at all. Eventually I stopped piling things on her and simply suggested that she poke around the New Order Mormon website, as she was trying to find a way to stay connected to the LDS community, but not necessarily believe what the LDS Church teaches and stands for. This was probably the best thing I could have done. I was trying to help her achieve her goal of staying partially connected to the church and give her space to do more exploring, without pressure. She continued her search on her own terms and eventually started discussions with me about the church. I had to fight to resist the urge to pile on and start giving her links when she brought up church issues. I had to regularly remind myself that she needed space. Now we're basically on the same page again. The post-Mormon process for both of us is continuing. One thing I've learned from both my experience with Bob and then from my experience on the other side of the table with my wife Heather is that when we confront a person with information that conflicts with their strongly held beliefs, they often retreat to a place of anger and fear. Rational arguments have little or no effect on a person who is fearful or angry. So what can we do so that we can eventually discuss our beliefs without pushing our family and friends into anger and or fear? Here are some ideas that Heather and I came up with. First of all, go slow. It may seem very urgent at the time, but if people feel like you're trying to force them to change their positions or beliefs, they'll probably dig in their heels and stop listening. Take the pressure off them so they don't feel like they have to choose either between you or the church. Second, if you let family and friends know about your change in beliefs, reinforce that you love them above all else, no matter what your new beliefs are. You can say something like, I'm still the same person as before, I'm just changing this part of my life. Next, give them time and space to go through the grieving process. Because in a way it is like something is dying or something major in their life is changing. And they'll go through the phases of shock, denial, anger, despair, and hopefully moving on in the end. I didn't sleep well for several weeks after Bob came out of the closet, and I believe that was part of me going through the grieving process of shock and denial. Next, go the extra mile to keep relationships up. Serve and be charitable. Don't make it easy for believing members to dismiss you as an angry apostate. Let your example cause some added cognitive dissonance in their minds. Next, after some time, when they bring up the subject, introduce them to something like Mormon stories or New Order Mormon. Don't make the LDS Church the center of discussion unless they initiate it. In other words, resist the urge to bury them with email and links to interesting articles, like both Bob and I tended to do. Keep doing the Mormon things that still feel good to you. For example, we still do family home evenings, although the topics for our lessons are radically different than before, or can be radically different than before. Have date nights. If you're comfortable, continue to bless the food or give thanks for food before dinner. As well, we should also feel a greater burden for the responsibility for being tolerant and understanding of our Mormon family members' worldview, because we are the ones who sought and embraced the change, not them. It's very hard for our true believing family and friends to see our perspective. Hopefully we can do a better job of seeing things from their perspective. And lastly, for a spouse, it would probably be helpful to nurture relationships outside the church to help in the transition if they at some point decide to change into more of a post-Mormon perspective. And lastly, don't forget, life is wonderful. This is our daughter Jillian. She's a vivacious, fun-loving, happy girl, and is always a reminder to me that life is great. We need to enjoy it. I hope you've gotten something out of this podcast. Just remember, don't put pressure on people. Let them move at their own pace. It's a lot easier when, as a couple, if you do things together, but if not, give them space to move at their own pace, and give them space to learn without feeling like they have to choose between either you or the church. Anyways, take care, and talk to you later.